Hello, welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Alistair Roff. I'm Executive Director at AIIA Victoria, and it's great to have you with us. There's been a lot of interest in this webinar, so welcome to AIIA members, our other guests, and members of the Diplomatic Corps also joining us. We'll be taking questions towards the end, so please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A tab in the toolbar or upvote on questions posed by other people, and we'll get through as many as we can. So to discuss Alexei Navalny and the Russian parliamentary elections, we're joined today by two experts, Will Partlett and Petr Kuzmin. Will is Associate Professor at Melbourne Law School. He's traveled extensively in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and his insights come from both his training in Russian politics and language and history at the universities of Oxford and Princeton, as well as his legal training at Stanford Law School. He's also working on a book entitled Demystifying Russia, the Navalny Movement, which maybe in due course we can persuade him to come and do a launch here, and hopefully in person. His interlocutor, Petr Kuzmin, is the president of Svoboda Alliance in Victoria, a pro-democracy community organization focused on promoting universal human rights and political freedoms in Russia and within the Russian diaspora in Australia. Will and Peter, thank you very much for joining us. I'll hand over to you, and I'll see you again shortly in the Q&A.
Thanks, Alistair, and thanks for everyone for coming. We really did want this to be in person, but you know, as it stands now, we can hopefully have a good discussion on Zoom, and and we can maybe reconvene at another time in person to discuss more. The idea of today's panel really is to talk a little bit about Alexei Navalny and what happened a couple weeks ago in the parliamentary elections, and in particular, what was the effectiveness of the Navalny movement, how and what does that teach us? What can we understand? I'm going to introduce very quickly just a few things for those of you who may not know a whole lot about Alexei Navalny. I'm just going to say a few things, and I'm going to pass it over to Peter. So the first thing I want to say about Alexei Navalny, myself as a lawyer and at a law school, I'm interested in him as he himself is legally trained. He's actually became a financial lawyer. And in fact, that was one of the ways in which he started his work that we all know him for now. I mean, he's very well known for his anti-corruption videos that are on YouTube that have hundreds and hundreds of millions of downloads. And of course, he got all that start by using his legal skills, by going essentially and buying shares in big companies and trying to say, look, where's the money going? Where's the following the money? All driven by this idea that, in fact, contrary to much messaging from the Kremlin is in the Russian state and the Russian system is highly neoliberal, right? It is kind of Russia incorporated. It is a privatized entity in many ways. He's also, Alexei Navalny, apart from being a lawyer, is also a politician and an activist. He, all the way back in 2000, joined the leading liberal party, Yabloko, and since then has always been very interested in politics, and actually ran for the Moscow mayor position in 2013. So he's had quite a lot of, and I think he's tried to start a number of different parties. They've all been blocked by the Russian state. I think about 9 or 10. So he has quite an interesting political platform. We can talk more about this in the Q&A if you want, but his political platform is big tent, right? Arguably even post-ideological. It is one where he's on one hand has had some pretty nationalist, xenophobic statements. He's made those, as well as having, taking traditional liberal positions, liberal constitutional positions, and so forth. And recently, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, has actually moved almost towards the kind of social democratic, almost kind of social democracy, communist, socialist kind of reign, and talking about opposing pension reform and so forth and so on. So in many cases he's very flexible ideologically, and of course he came to prominence really in the West with his poisoning last year and the subsequent jailing earlier this year. He now has been in prison, I think, for over 200 days. Petr, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll say that I want to highlight that Navalny started off as a conventional politician, joining a conventional party, the most established Democratic Party. Yabloko, but he was kicked out of it for his attempt to broaden the base. So the Yabloko party has always been quite comfortable with having a sort of a hardcore supporter group, and was very hesitant to reach out to a broader population. And what Navalny has been doing over the past 15 years, he has constantly been trying to broaden his base of support. He is known for reaching out to the nationalist movements back in 2000s, where he joined the so-called Russian March. And his goal was to try and reason with those nationalists and actually win them over into a more democratic way of pushing for their agenda. So then that nationalist movement was co-opted by the Kremlin, so he distanced himself from it, and he focused on his anti-corruption work. And through his blog at first, and then later on, he set up a number of initiatives, civic initiatives, which were aimed at giving something to the ordinary Russian that they can use to actually make their lives better. So there was a project called Ros-ЖКХ, which was aimed at filing complaints to the authorities so that the communal housing is improved. There was a project called Rosyama. Again, it's a digital platform, something that nowadays is fairly common, where you lodge a petition through this website. It creates a petition for you, you print it out and you lodge it, and it's written in the way that the authorities have to deal with. So that way, he actually brought more people into his movement, attracted the attention of more and more people, and I can say that that's the point where I got interested in him. It was back in 2010 that I started following him, even from Australia, because he became quite noticeable to just mainstream Russians, I think. And he did try to set up his own party. He did try to register 9 times, and every time he was denied. So in the end, over the past 2 years, he was left without any legal way of participating in politics. So that's where he formed his new strategy called the smart voting strategy. And it's the way for him to try and have an influence on Russian politics, even when he and his supporters cannot run for office. So this is, and it was used first in 2019 in Moscow elections, then in 2020 in some regional elections, and this year, a couple of weeks ago, it was used for the first time at the federal level in parliamentary elections.
And on this, Peter, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about, which ones are more effective. I mean, one of the things that I think draws these together is I think an interesting, all of these put together. You think of Navalny's anti-corruption videos, you think of his legal aid platforms, really what you're talking about, these ones,
Yes.
Rosyama, ros-ЖКХ, like these are essentially giving, people the opportunity to make petitions and to get the government to do what it's meant to be doing. All of them, if you think about them together, what are they trying to do? It seems that they're trying to basically send one message, which is the current regime, the current state is not actually delivering on its promises, right? The current system was always talking about it being a strong state, a silное государство, and a lot of these are pointing out, well, look, a strong state can't fix potholes in the road. It can't actually fix communal space in your apartment building. A strong, money is being siphoned off all over through to Cyprus and all different places. So that all these are kind of part of a kind of strong messaging, kind of regime that is really trying to send one message, which is one of this current regime is actually not competent, because of course that is the central message that the regime is always pushing. And maybe it's now worth turning to smart voting, because I think that's and particularly talk about the parliamentary elections themselves, because I think that's really what we want to spend most of our time talking about. how would you, Peter, would you, give us a little rundown of the results, and then a little bit about, was this effective, right? Because as many of you probably have been following on the internet, there has been a significant crackdown on in fact, the Russian state internet regulator has shut down, I think, 50 websites. Google, and we're going to talk about this in a moment, Google and Apple both pulled the smart voting app from their Apple stores and the Google store. So there's been obviously Navalny's in jail. A lot of his supporters are either in exile or in jail. So there's been a serious crackdown on all this activity, which was largely allowed for a while, and now has been really, since August of last year, has really been changed. So how effective was it? I mean, this is the first real trial run we've seen for the Navalny movement since post-crackdown. Peter, how did it go? What were the results, and how did smart voting work, and did it work?
Maybe I'll step back at first and describe the mechanics of the Russian political system first. So, and first I'd like to say a few words about the Kremlin strategy. So what it's been trying to do in these federal parliamentary elections, it has three-pronged approach. One is to use its administrative muscle and kind of pressure the government workers and the employees of the state corporations to vote for the United Russia Party. United Russia Party is Vladimir Putin's party. It had 76% of seats, supermajority, constitutional majority. It can change the constitution, which it did last year. So it's important for Putin to maintain this massive power base that mints laws, whichever laws that he wants. So one element was to use the government workers and corporate workers in the state sector to vote for United Russia. But then the other approach was to drive down participation for everyone else. So these elections had an unprecedented low level of publicity about them. So you could see a few billboards on the streets, on TV, it was hardly covered. And then on social media, there was lots of messaging from the so-called Kremlin bots, from some of the leaders of opinion, saying that the best way for anybody who is in disagreement with this, with the ruling regime, is to boycott the elections. So this message of boycotting the election, that this is the moral, the ethical way of participating in fake elections, because these are not real elections. Lots of true opposition candidates weren't allowed to run. So the message was to try and drive down the participation for anybody who is opposed to this regime. And the third one is to try and split the vote of the opposition. So anybody who still decides to come to the polls, the goal is to make them vote for different candidates, different parties, so that in the end, United Russia retains its majority. A note on the Russia uses a mixed electoral system for parliamentary elections. So 50% of seats, 225, is elected according to party votes. So people are voting for parties, and only parties that get at least 5% of the vote get a seat in seats allocated for the parliament. In these elections, there were 14 different parties. And the reason why there were so many is because the Kremlin wanted to split the vote, so that all of those small parties, they get 1% or 0.5%. And in the end, United Russia and the main opposition parties get the rest. And then the second half of the seats are allocated in the so-called single mandate races. These are regional races. And again, multiple candidates are registered. Strong opposition candidates are not allowed to run. And there, it's a winner-take-all system. So a United Russia candidate, even if it gets only 20% of the total vote, it can still win. if the remainder of the vote is split. So now, so the point of the smart voting strategy is to actually consolidate the protest vote. What it meant in practice is that the advice was for people to vote for only for the main parties that could not United Russia, but the main systemic opposition parties that are guaranteed to have more than 5% of the votes. And that really worked. Lots of people followed that advice, and that's how KPRF increased its seats by 14, if I'm not mistaken.
And by KPRF, you mean the Communist Party of the Russian Federation?
Yes.
Not to be confused with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And we're going to talk more about them because they are an interesting part of this, part of this story. And just to say, big 20,000 feet picture here. Why do elections matter in Russia? It's an authoritarian state. Well, they matter for a couple of reasons. Some of the reasons that Peter's pointing out, they matter because they want to have the ruling party. They want to have their people in positions of decision making, right? Because there's still institutions, their parliaments, all are, the parliament exists in Russia and so forth. But they also matter, and the Kremlin really wants a big win because they want to perform. In many cases, performance is a key aspect of their power. They want to show not just to Russians, but also overseas that they're in control. And this will keep a lot of, there's always rumors about large numbers of people who work in the state, bureaucrats and so forth, who might just say, look, this state isn't working. We'll follow someone else. And that's where the Navalny is. So they need to constantly at elections. I mean, it's pretty clear they're almost always going to win elections. They would need to win big. So as a result, they have to do everything they can to obscure, co-opt, fragment, do the kinds of things Peter's talking about to really get us there.
Yeah.
And so what was the result in the end a couple weeks ago?
Yeah. So the result was that United Russia managed to maintain its constitutional majority. It still has 72% of the seats in the State Duma. However, it came at a heavy cost to appearances. So the level of falsifications and electoral fraud was huge, and it was quite visible to lots of people. So there are thousands of videos of people at the polls, members, so independent monitors being forcibly removed, for example. There are videos of members of the local electoral committees stuffing ballot boxes with reams of ballots, presumably for United Russia Party. There is lots of irregularities in the actual results. So at the polling stations where you had independent observers present who could certify the accuracy of the vote count, you saw very low turnout, about 36-38%, and very low vote for United Russia Party. But then at the polling stations where you have very few, where you didn't have independent observers, you had extremely high turnout, close to 100%. There are some regions where Chechnya, for example, United Russia got 99.8% of the vote there, and the turnout was close to 100%. So obviously this is completely falsified. So there are political scientists who do statistical analysis of the results. There are 96,000 individual polling places, and you can look at the results from those each individual polling station, and you can analyze and see the anomalies. So statistical methods are used to do this analysis, and there's very authoritative statistician, Sergei Shpilkin. He estimates that 13.8 million fake votes were added to United Russia. And in total, there were 52 million votes cast. So it's a huge proportion that was artificially added to United Russia.
And we're going to get to this in a moment, but was some of those, because one of the first things that this is the first time I think there's been electronic voting was introduced for the first time, and some of them were from electronic voting. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Some of it was.
We'll leave that for later. But that's one thing we're going to talk about, is that there's been a few quote unquote innovations, and one of them has been the use of electronic voting, which has, I think, led to some additional ways of falsification.
So that's one of the outcomes of the election. So United Russia did maintain its majority. It still lost 19 seats. So it's still a minor, but it's still a win. And the smart voting strategy, it did have a massive effect. You could see, as the first results were coming in from polling stations, you could see that there was almost a landslide. Russia has 11 time zones. So when the first polling places were in the Far East were closing down, you could see the results. They were disastrous for United Russia. And gradually, all the falsifications kicked in. And it culminated with this election in Moscow, where the results of the electronic election were announced only 18 hours later, even though electronic results are available automatically, pretty much. They were announced only 18 hours later, and the results were completely reversed. So what came from the ground versus what came electronically. But smart voting managed to two important outcomes. One is United Russia received, for the first time ever, United Russia received less than 50% of votes. That's even according to the official count. And that's important. So it can no longer claim that it has the support of the majority of people. That's significant. Even according to their own count, they still don't have the majority. And then in the single mandate races, 15 candidates, smart voting candidates, they managed to win a seat. And there were literally several dozen other races where the results were reversed, magically reversed. So the smart voting, in principle, what it was trying to do in the single mandate races is to identify the strongest candidate to challenge the United Russia candidate. And it successfully did it in 82% of cases. So with these falsified results, it still identified the strong candidate, the best opponent for United Russia or the pro-Kremlin candidate in 82% of cases. That's quite astonishing. That's a really good result. And it's better than what Navalny's team achieved in 2019 and 2020. But then, yes, the government managed to retain the majority for United Russia through falsifications.
So let's step back a little bit as well and talk. I mean, there's some quite interesting tech kind of implications of this. One of them is, I think, is to think a little bit about what this teaches us, and particularly talk. So I think it was the day before the election. So on the 16th of September, Apple and Google, after almost a month of requests from the Russian state, decided to delete or remove the smart voting app from their Apple stores and their Google stores. This caught everyone off guard, because in many people just thought, okay, because for a long time the big tech companies have, in many cases, kind of ignored the Russian state. Twitter has ignored them and racked up fines, and they've often paid the fines. Kind of just, and there's a bit of a game being played. But this is the first time we've seen a significant step by a big tech company like Google or Apple, and in fact, in this case, both of them, to pull off the kind of what Peter's just talking about, the kind of key opposition voting app, smart voting, and they pulled it from their stores, and which is actually quite significant in a way that it actually worked as well as it did. Suggests that people were ready and kind of maybe even preparing for this. But it does tend to suggest, and there's a bigger story here, we can talk more in the Q&A, but I'll just give a brief intro, is to say this actually, and there's been quite a lot of speculation. Why did they do this? Why did Google and Apple decide to delete this app? And I think there's two answers. One, Google and Apple both said that since there's been a lot of legislative activity in Russia around the internet since 2017, trying to get control of the internet, because of course Navalny is not just the only. There have been a number of others, essentially the internet's the last area where you can actually speak freely in Russia. And now increasing numbers of people, I think most people under the age of 40 don't watch state media, don't read print media. They get all their news and all their information from the internet. So the government is like, we need to control this. And they've put in a couple kind of different laws. One of them requires all big tech companies now to have an office and to have employees in Russia. This is important because of what some people have called the hostage effect, right? It's like, well, if you're not doing what we say, we're going to prosecute your employees. And that is what Google and Apple both said had happened, that the Russian state had given a list of people who were going to be put in prison if they did not pull these apps down. The second thing they threatened to do, which also is really, I think, quite interesting, is they said, what we'll do is slow down the internet to your actual apps. We're going to block Apple Pay and Google Pay. And this is, of course, significant in Russia. Why? Russia is the biggest internet market in Europe. Russia has 140 million people, and its internet penetration is huge in Russia. So they stand. So basically, what one expert called this was a de-escalation attack, essentially by Google and Apple, is saying, look, we're going to de-escalate now. We're going to back off because we cannot lose this market, which tends to suggest that actually the new sovereign internet, at least in Russia, is not going to be someone, Putin with his, switching it off with the big old red switch kind of thing. In fact, it's actually just using the fact that ultimately Google and Apple and these big tech companies, what's their ultimate? The profit, right? That's what they're driven by. And as a result, and the government knows that, the state knows that, and that's exactly how they pressured them, and that's why they backed off. And I think this is really significant. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that the sovereign internet is going to mean isolation, China style, for the Russians. It means that these big tech operators, they're going to continue to operate, but they're just going to be having to kind of toe the line. Otherwise, they're going to lose money. And the question will be for them down the road, and it seems like they made a decision 2 weeks ago, which hasn't got a lot of media, but I think is a really important one, is to say, we're going to prioritize profits over democratic values. Now, that shouldn't probably be a surprise to us, but it does kind of poke a little hole in the kind of cyber utopianism of Silicon Valley and so forth.
I want to add to that point that Russian government has certainly upped its game in control over the internet. So compared to 2 or 3 years ago, when it tried to fight Telegram app, it's an app that used around the world, and they tried to block it in Russia, and they failed miserably. They managed to block the government websites instead of blocking Telegram, and there was a big public fight in which Navalny participated, and the broad, basically Russian community participated in fighting for Telegram. So the government has given up on that, on trying to block Telegram, but it found a way to call Pavel Durov, the founder of that company, and there was a Telegram bot that provided smart voting recommendations. So Pavel Durov pulled it down from Telegram, blocked it again the last 2 days of the election. So the government certainly found a way of dealing with big tech giants. So it's putting pressure on YouTube. There was a video that Navalny team put out with the recommendation. It was taken down, was blocked. They published Google Docs with just in a text form all the recommendations. So at first, the government tried to block Google Docs access across all of Russia, which was kind of an awful effect. There was a big outcry. So they managed to get Google to block just those documents. So it was amazing just watching this game of cat and mouse happened very dramatically over those 3 days of the election. Was just amazing, because one effect that it achieved, one positive, was that it really motivated, it attracted lots of attention. So the so-called Barbra Streisand effect. So more and more people found out about smart voting because of all these government attempts to block it. And also it made people, individuals, into these evangelists for smart voting. So there was an explosion of people providing recommendations. So people, Russians outside of Russia, like myself, we were sending recommendations to our friends and relatives in Russia and saying, okay, these are your candidates in your region. So it actually motivated and energized the community, the opposition community, all of these attempts.
So Petr, we've got 10 minutes left before we're going to open the Q&A. So let's turn to we'll talk a little bit about what this means for the future of Russian opposition. And I want to ask you about, because one of the big winners in smart voting, the Navalny app smart voting actually was very successful in getting the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, has got more seats than I think they've ever had in the Duma. What does that mean? And what's the general strategy going forward? What's the role of what is this Communist Party of the Russian Federation going to do in power? Well, who are they? Who are these new deputies? Tell us a little bit about that. And then we'll turn at the very end to just talk a little bit about what this might mean for Australia and how the Australia and the West might react. So tell us a little bit about the future of the opposition movement and the Communist Party.
Yeah. So the whole idea behind smart voting is that what it's trying to achieve is make the work of destroy the monopoly of power of United Russia, make it deal with the opposition. Even though we have pocket opposition, there are 3 establishment opposition parties that have been there since the early 90s. Their leaders, older than Putin, and their relics, everybody makes fun of them. So they were becoming increasingly irrelevant. But the idea is that if people pull together and elect somebody, even if it's a bad candidate, if it's a candidate that the majority of people don't support ideologically, but if that person is elected, that person will feel empowered by this popular support, and they will increase competition within the system. So they will stand up to United Russia. They will stand up to the opposition. So and Communist Party of Russia, with all its baggage, it's actually the most effective opposition party right now. Since the start of this year, when Navalny came back, there were all these protests around Russia. The Communist Party, energized Communist Party, it became to act more independent. It started acting more independently. So there was a raft of repressive laws passed in the first half of the year. One of them basically designated Alexei Navalny's organization, political organization, was called extremist, was designated as an extremist organization, and anybody who ever supported it, whichever form, whether they sent money, whether they worked for it, or any form of support, they could be denied the right to run for office, any office. And it disenfranchised literally millions of people, because millions of people have supported Navalny's organization over the past few years. And so United Russia passed this law, but the only party that voted against it en masse was the Communist Party. So and it was very vocal about its opposition. So now, and there was even talk about Communist Party being deregistered from the election, not being allowed to run, because it was gaining too much popular support. There was just coalescence of popular support around it. So now what people in the opposition, they're hoping to see is that the Communist Party will become this agent of change. It's surreal for most of democratic opposition people like myself. It's surreal to be voting for a communist party. But the Communist Party has evolved. It's not the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It actually has an establishment wing, very conservative party apparatus people. And then there's a young guard, these young politicians who have basically social democratic values. They want to represent the interests of the workers, of teachers, of professors, etc. And they're the ones who are able to talk to people and get lots of support. There are a couple of stars of this year. One of them, Mikhail Lobanov, completely unknown just 3 months ago. But in this election, the level of his support was massive. And he's a Moscow State University physics professor, young, under 40, and he has this broad support. And that's not because people are supporting the communist ideology, it's because they want people who are active political figures who will fight for their rights. So it remains to be seen. So the government will try to co-opt the Communist Party as it successfully did in the past. But we all are watching with some anticipation to see how it will play out.
And the evolution, I mean, interestingly, from a comparative point of view in Europe, is you've seen in other Eastern European countries, communist parties develop into essentially social democratic parties, which, you know, they're not the old kind of vanguard Leninist kind of we want to be the only party in town like we have in say in People's Republic of China. These are parties and individuals and politicians who are actually committed to multi-party competition. They're committed to they have a particular ideology which is tied to kind of to social redistribution. There's I think some debate over nationalization and so forth, but we can talk more in the Q&A about that. I want to, in the last 5 minutes, I just want to talk a little bit about what this means, what potentially this means for Australia. What can Australia do? Now, there is actually, you know, Russia seems a long way away, but in many cases, there's actually a debate going on right now in Parliament that is really relevant to what's happening, and that is Australia is currently in the process of updating its sanctions laws, and in particular, thinking about modernizing them through a series of amendments that would make it easier for Australia to use its sanction laws as less of a kind of blunt instrument that hits a particular sector, or that is you know has to be unified with the UN in some sort of way, but instead actually to have them targeted, personalized sanctions that will target particular individuals who themselves are involved in human rights abuses or other forms of kind of democratic problems. And this is going to, in the US and the UK and Canada have all passed these under what's called the Magnitsky Act, is what they've been called. There's currently, I think, you know, and it looks like by the end of this year, we'll see whether this is going to take a little bit longer because of all the other stuff happening, obviously, in Australia. But there is a very active discussion of how to do this. And this, of course, is important. One of the key things that the Navalny movement and many members of the opposition, not just Navalny and his team, have suggested is that one of the most effective ways for international support to Russia's democratic movement is not big sector-wide sanctions, the old school sanctions we see where you basically cripple an economy. Of course, that hits everyone. That's not, and in fact, many cases that actually helps. That'll help Putin because Putin can, and the regime can complain. Oh well, we have economic problems. It's not our problem. It's because of the West. They've put sanctions on us. Instead, the approach is to say, look, let's hit corrupt individuals. Now, corruption, obviously, Navalny has shown us how corrupt this regime is. Let's hit corrupt individuals, those who have been connected with human rights abuses, and particularly, either take away their money, take away their ability to travel, sanction individuals. Now, that is a way of hitting at the very heart of this regime, and that's something actually that Australia at the moment could bring into effect, and I think, and we hope goes into effect. But I think that's one thing that is why we think all this discussion we're having today is actually important to understand, is to say, look, there is a serious democratic movement underway. It is, and it's of course complex as we've been talking about, but one that requires, that in many cases can be supported from the outside in a limited way. Of course, not. It's up to Russia to decide how they govern themselves, but in some ways, kind of sanctions laws and these amendments can actually play. Australia can play an important role in coordination with the United States, with the UK and Canada, which of course, all of which are part of the Five Eyes, are going to used to working with these allies already in trying to support some of these movements, right? And then particularly the Navalny movement, smart voting, to try to at least, because one of the key strategies, and there's actually a new book out on Navalny, which is very good on this, is that the key Navalny strategies, it's like, well, what does he stand for? At this point, he's not really a traditional political player, right? He doesn't stand for a particular ideology. What they talk about is a stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 at the moment is to essentially say, look, you have an entrenched system that really, let's be honest, doesn't have any ideology at all. I mean, United Russia Party has zero ideology, and as Peter's already pointed out, is already, Russians really recognize that, and their real approval ratings are extremely low. Probably below 30%. But the idea is to try to say to dislodge this so that you can have political competition, right, in the country. And then, of course, likely would play. It seems like, I think Hardy's probably somewhere on the kind of center liberal aspect of politics, and then there'd be debate, and you'd have, you know, the kind of things you see in other Eastern European countries play out. But at this point, it's a matter of trying to get this entrenched regime out of, and at least some targeted sanctions laws can actually help in that process. There's been some discussion about that with Belarus as well, and which has a similar movement. So I think we're really out of time. We're pretty much out of time. You have any last 1 minute?
Just one last comment. I want to say that for a very long time, for almost 20 years, Putin and United Russia could rely on this narrative, this myth of broad popular support. And they conducted elections to demonstrate that Putin has a huge approval ratings, and then his party is winning the majority of the vote. The problem for the ruling regime right now is that this picture is shattered. Even according to the government's own polls before the election, less than 30% of people wanted to vote for United Russia. It's the level of falsifications, again, showing that only with huge use of with the repression. So you have the repression of the all independent media have now been designated as either extremist organizations or foreign agents, including the election monitoring movement, 20-year-old organization. It has now been called it has been a foreign agent, but now even individuals on that list are calling foreign agents. So it's the regime, in order to maintain its control, this complete control of the political sphere, it's becoming much more obviously autocratic and more like a dictatorship. Previously, it was a dictatorship of the majority. Yeah. Now it's the dictatorship of the minority. And I feel that it really unties the hands of the Western countries. There is a difference now. Previously, you could say, well, it's up to the Russians to elect their own government. But right now, you cannot say that Russians have elected this government. Russians have elected this this parliament. So I feel that there's definitely a greater possibility right now for Australia, for the United States, for other countries to take a more active role in countering Putin's regime.
Right. So should we take some questions?
Excellent. Yeah, Will and Peter, thank you. You've covered a huge amount of ground there. Well done getting through it. I wish we had more time. I just want to come back to the smart voting, because that was fascinating. Did you see a difference between the larger cities and the rural areas in terms of its impact? And I suppose that also goes to Navalny's supporter base. Is there a difference between cities and rural areas?
There's definitely a difference, and that's why the government was doing some gerrymandering. So the way the electoral regions were cut out is that the urban areas were mixed together with regional areas, rural areas. So you had these very artificial, very weird regions, and but that still didn't help. In a number of those regions, the number of the opposition vote was still too strong. So yes, even though there is a difference, and the government is trying to exploit that difference, it's becoming more and more difficult to do it.
And can I just say as well, one of the really interesting dynamics in Russian politics at the moment is actually outside Moscow. There's even more opposition to particularly United Russia, because this is where, one of the things that Putin has done in the last 20 years is centralize all the money in Moscow. Go to Moscow. It is a shining, beautiful city, parks, all this stuff. You go to the regions and it's not the same. It's really stagnating. Even a place like St. Petersburg is stagnating somewhat in comparison with the amount of money concentrated in Moscow. So in many cases, the Kremlin's worried about this as well. And it goes back to Peter's point, which is, you see over time, it might have been the case that, Putin and United Russia actually were popular maybe 10 years ago, but they're losing that. I mean, the COVID response has been completely dysfunctional. And of course, just economic, schools aren't working, roads got potholes in them. People are living in, and Navalny's always saying this, right? Russians are living like we have all these resources. He's always comparing Russia to Canada, or he could compare it to Australia, right? Big country, all these resources, yet the money's all being siphoned off to Switzerland, so I think the regions really feel that. So in many ways, and that's where the Communist Party candidates have done well. I think, and smart voting kind of pushed that.
Yes.
What about, Navalny's supporter base and the demographics? Like, if and when Putin retires, do you think United Russia is going to lose support? Will younger voters have a different attitude to the way elections are conducted?
It's already evident that, yes, for sure. Unfortunately, as in many other countries, the younger voters tend not to participate at all in the elections. So right now, it is more the middle-aged who are participating in the elections, and only the very over 50s. That's where the support for United Russia is still stronger. But anybody younger than 50, they're really much more skeptical and critical of the government.
And I will say as well, obviously the most dangerous period for the current Russian system is when Putin steps down. So much of the regime's plank, the legitimacy of the regime rests on Putin, and in fact, one of the interesting things about prior to this parliamentary election is they had to because Putin's kind of tried to distance himself a bit from United Russia because he knows that they're unpopular, but they had to bring him back in a bit to shore it up because they were afraid the whole thing was going to collapse. So there's a real question whether when Putin goes, the United Russia Party itself might just disappear. And what would keep it together? It has no ideology. It has zero. It really has nothing holding it together other than self-interest, which is that these guys get to basically get a piece of the pie, right? They get to steal when they're, and that's the way it operates. So it's the transition of power is really the kind of $1 million question in Russian politics.
And I want to add to this that United Russia has always been positioned as the party of stability. These revolutionary changes in Russia have been so traumatic for the people. The 90s have been very traumatic that the strongest narrative is that United Russia and Putin, they are keeping everything stable. We are moving in the right direction. The problem for the government is that since 2014, economy has been stagnating. Involvements abroad have been not particularly successful either. So there is this, there is stability, but it's now more and more people are realizing that we're moving in the wrong direction, and they start questioning the stability. Do they really want this stability? And once enough people realize that, okay, we would prefer change, then it would be really the end of United Russia Party.
Peter, can you just talk a little bit about how the voting went in some of the unrecognized territory? I mean, Eastern Ukraine or Abkhazia, North Ossetia. Is there a difference there in the pattern?
Yes, the reason why these unrecognized territories of Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, Abkhazia, and the Georgian territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, people vote there because the government have issued, Russian government issued them Russian passports, and they're basically buying votes this way. So the level of support, because you can see quite granular electoral results, you can see the level of support. So people abroad can vote for Russia, like Australian Russians could vote like myself. But in those regions, the proportion of votes for United Russia is huge, like 70. Well, it's no longer in the 70s, but it's about 50-60%. Whereas in other foreign territories like United States, Germany, Australia, United Russia was getting below 20%. So there's a massive difference there.
Okay, actually, that brings me neatly to the next question. I was going to ask whether the Russian diaspora overseas has the right to vote. Apparently, yes. So what role does the diaspora, and I've no idea how big it is, but what role does the diaspora play in all this?
for me, as a representative of Russian diaspora, this has been the most exciting development of this year, really. So Kremlin has pushed out real opposition. So pretty much the whole Alexei Navalny's team has been forced to leave the country. So they are now in Lithuania, in Poland, Germany. So they are based abroad. And previously, I felt uneasy, ethically uneasy about being too active in politics. But right now, the government has forced people out, and there's been quite an awakening, what we can see. So there were these protests in Russia when Alexei Navalny came back. Mm-hmm. The most unexpected thing was that there were similar protests all over the world. So there were 3,000 people in German cities coming out, in LA and San Francisco. In Australia, there were we actually had coordinated rallies in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane, Canberra, also in Wellington and Auckland, in New Zealand. So the Russian diaspora, previously very disengaged, is actually getting a lot more active now. And for these elections, there was a project set up by volunteers, completely volunteer project, Vote Abroad. So the goal was to get training for independent observers, attract more people to polling stations, and really make it a lot more organized. And that largely worked. So there were 500 volunteers who signed up. I participated in the project as a coordinator for the observers. We had in Australia, in Sydney, we had 3 people monitoring the election that spent their 16 hours at the polling station. So this is a very significant development. So I see the Russian diaspora becoming a lot more active politically going forward.
And I suppose this is all brought into sharp relief the significance of Navalny for Russia and the rest of the world. You know, he's the main trigger of positive change. Will talked about the Magnitsky Act, for example, but what can the other countries, I mean, Europe or some of the developed economies, do, or are they doing to support him or make a difference here?
I mean, I think the targeted sanctions are, you know, and this is a really relatively recent thing in sanctions, you know, because sanctions have been a really blunt tool for a very long time. But I think, you know, in the last 2 to 3 to 4 years, you start to see, you know, the targeted sanctions come into effect, and they really are effective ways of hitting regimes like the one in Russia, not just the one in Russia, other authoritarian regimes, because, you know, what they, you know, the Russian regime at the moment really has no ideology, right? It's neither, I mean, it can, one day Putin can be a leftist, the next he can be a rightist. He can talk about, you know, traditional marriage on one hand, and then he can start giving handouts to pensioners on the next, right? Which they did, by the way, prior to this election. They gave all pensioners a big check, right? So that, you know, he's moving, he's very, but how do you kind of disrupt this? It's very difficult to run. This is one of the reasons why Navalny is doing this big tent approach, is you say, look, you need to basically have a big tent to try to dislodge this, because it's constantly, you know, it's very flexible and moving. Another way from the outside, and you know, like Navalny, and not just Navalny, other opposition movements in the former Soviet republics, like Belarus, for instance, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, are asking for targeted, right? This idea, you target individuals, because of course those individuals, like, you know, there was a party that was just created for this parliamentary election, the so-called new people, and those were set up essentially by a kind of oligarch buddy of Putin. So how do you, you know, it ultimately operates on this kind of, you know, what people call this, you know, real self-interest, and everyone's getting, you know, siphoning off money here, there, and other, and they're all traveling to their homes in Europe and elsewhere. The more you can deny them this ability to do this, the more they're going to see, well, I'm not getting anything out of this, right? So much of this is about kind of economic self-interest for particular individuals, the big oligarchs who essentially are state, you know, kind of supported. That's a really important way for, you know, because so you know, so international financial institutions are complicit in this, international, you know, real estate businesses and so forth. And so governments can step in and try to block some of this activity, because, you know, it is true. On one hand, you know, these guys will talk about, you know, protecting Russian sovereignty. On the other hand, they'll send their children to school in, you know, private school in Switzerland for you know, and buy villas in Italy. You know, there actually is a soft underbelly to this system, and and that's why Navalny is such a threat. Is he's able, and if he can get some support from people who kind of understand this, and that's what that kind of targeted sanction based stuff is. It'll multiply the effect of an already growing, because it is fair to say under the age of 40, people in Russia are getting, as Peter's pointing out, are getting getting kind of like they're ready for change. They want something new. They've had the same guy in power for 21 years now, and it's time to move into a new stage so that the Russian state can actually do what it's meant to do, deliver things for its people rather than just perform.
Yeah, sure. And what's the role of the press? Are they giving much coverage to Navalny and his party?
Well, Peter, you can talk about that. I mean, really, the state
in Russia, in Russia, the state media is trying not to cover Navalny at all, but it did change this year. So when he came back, he actually forced for many years, Navalny was not covered at all. He was a non-figure. Putin famously never calls him by name, and just to deny him platform, deny him recognition. This year, it all changed. There was lots of coverage of the court, his appearance in court. Of course, it was all negative. And of course, they're trying to paint a picture, but it became impossible for the state media to avoid him completely. And then there is the remnants of the independent media. So the government has been designating them as foreign agents. And the problem with that is that as soon as a media company is designated that, it loses its ad revenue. So the local businesses, they stop buying ads there, and it's a death kind of life and death situation. There are several independent media outlets that closed down in the last few months because they just couldn't see how they can operate with this new status. Several others, there is Dorst TV Rain. That's the only independent station that just recently got designated as a foreign agent. So they rely on subscriptions. Medusa, another independent outlet, it had to go just ask for money. It's crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, operating income. And that's really what Navalny has been doing for many years. He has been extremely successful at crowdsourcing, crowdfunding all of his projects. And now anybody who is doing anything independently is forced to do the same. There's no other way of getting money.
Well, we're unfortunately getting to the end of our allotted time. So perhaps the same question to both of you, which is pretty simple. What do you think is Navalny's future?
Peter, you want to go first?
I'll try. So even after the election, just a couple of days ago, a new there's a new case against Navalny. So in total, he's facing 26 years in jail. There are 4 near convictions that he's facing. So he could, as long as Putin is in power, Navalny will remain in jail. Unfortunately, that's the reality. And it's really, I think it's his challenge to the rest of progressively thinking Russians is to actually wake up and try to become more active, not necessarily run for office or being politically active, but there are other ways that we can support civic initiatives and just learn about how the system works. And once there's enough people, enough Russians who are actively resisting this regime, there will be a regime change. And that's when Alexei Navalny will be free. That's my forecast.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think it's interesting. I mean, Navalny himself, I think when he went back to Russia, he knew this was going to happen. But he's always said, and he continues to say it that he's optimistic about the future of Russia, that this current regime cannot stay in power forever, that in many cases, as he keeps saying, it's actually a regime that is deeply insecure because it knows its deep weaknesses. Yep. But he is, I mean, I agree with Peter, Navalny they will keep him in prison as long as the system is is able to operate, and that will be, you know, through what I expect to see some form. And again, this will be the most dangerous period for them. And I think the period when the regime was most likely to collapse is during a period of transition away from Putin, when they try to set someone else up in his position. Because of course Putin won't live forever. That is going to happen. When that's going to happen, neither of us can predict. But you know, I think in the short term, the Navalny movement is going to be one of just kind of a holding pattern. Navalny's going to be in prison, but there is a medium and long-term prognosis that I think is more optimistic.
And briefly, I mean, is Navalny's health good enough to withstand all this, or is it in their interests not to turn him into a martyr and keep him alive?
Seems like it is
it has definitely improved. So he was on hunger strike, and there was a point where it looked like he would die. I believe that he would die imminently. Fortunately, he recovered from that. Now he seems to be in good spirits, and I really hope that nothing. Of course, he's in the hands of the regime. They could poison him. They have all sorts of substances available to them, other means.
They know they're being watched now, right? The international,
but they are being watched,
and you know, it's important for the internet. That's the other thing the international community can do, is keep a focus on him, right? Because he in many cases, not just him. I mean, he has a whole movement behind him, but he is the flashpoint now, right? And keep focus on him is a very important thing, because that keeps him alive. And you know, in many cases, I mean, he's a symbol. Whether he'll ever be Russian president, I think he probably won't ever be Russian president, but will he be a catalyst? Much more likely to, and be remembered as a catalyst, you know, in the grand sweep of history.
Okay, well, that brings us to the end of an action-packed hour. Thank you, Will and Peter, for coming along and discussing in so much detail. Will, keep us posted on how your book's going, but we'd love to get you back here. So hopefully in the new year, we're back to face-to-face. But it's a really interesting topic. We'll keep an eye on it, and really appreciate your time. And to the audience, sorry I didn't get to all the questions, but really appreciate your interest, especially on a Friday evening. So thank you to everyone. Stay well and see you again soon.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks, guys.